4:15 in the morning. The Taiwan Strait. The destroyer DDG-62 USS Fitzgerald cut through the dark water at a steady 20 knots. Every sensor on the ship indicated an empty sea, yet at that exact moment, the hull was passing directly over a shadow that did not exist on any navigational chart. The air over the strait was heavy with the scent of brine and the low-frequency thrum of 4 gas turbine engines. Below the waterline, a magnetic trigger clicked, and the world began to end for the 330 sailors on board. The explosion did not sound like a blast to those on the bridge. It was a physical hammer blow that lifted the 8,400 tons of steel 2 meters out of the water. The sound was a deep, guttural groan of tearing metal, followed by a shockwave that shattered every piece of glass on the bridge and threw the watchstanders into the bulkheads. The USS Fitzgerald, an Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyer and a cornerstone of the 7th Fleet, had just been struck by a high-explosive naval mine in a channel that the United States Navy had declared clear of all hazards only 6 hours prior. The mine was a sophisticated, stealth-coated influence weapon, likely a Chinese-made EM-52, designed to rest on the seabed and wait for the specific acoustic signature of a large surface combatant. It had been planted in the deep silt of the strait, hidden from the ship's AN/SQQ-89 sonar suite. When it detonated, it released a gas bubble of such immense pressure that it buckled the keel of the ship, the very spine that held the vessel together. Inside the skin of the ship, the situation was catastrophic. The blast had occurred directly beneath the No. 2 machinery room and the forward berthing compartments. Hundreds of tons of seawater erupted through a jagged 3-meter hole in the hull. The temperature of the water in the strait was a chilling 24 degrees, but the heat from the ruptured fuel lines and electrical fires turned the interior spaces into a hell of steam and screaming metal. On the bridge, the commanding officer fought to find his feet as the emergency red lighting flickered on. The ship was already listing 7 degrees to starboard. The ANSPY-1 Delta radar screens, the eyes of the ship's Aegis combat system, were dark. The shock of the blast had tripped every circuit breaker in the forward half of the vessel, leaving the crew blind in one of the most contested waterways on the planet. The air was quickly filling with the acrid, chemical stench of burning insulation and the heavy smell of marine diesel. Report status, the commanding officer shouted over the roar of the emergency sirens. His voice was steady, the result of 2 decades of United States Navy discipline, but his eyes were locked on the inclinometer as the needle continued to crawl toward 10 degrees. The report that came back over the sound-powered phones was a litany of disasters. Machinery Room 2 was completely flooded. The forward auxiliary room was taking on water at a rate that the main bilge pumps could not match. Most critically, the ship had lost all propulsion. The USS Fitzgerald was no longer a state-of-the-art warship. It was an 8,400-ton steel box drifting in the dark, 300 miles from the nearest friendly port. Outside, the Taiwan Strait remained deceptively calm. The surface of the water was like black glass, reflecting the stars that were just beginning to fade as the first hint of dawn touched the eastern horizon. But beneath that surface, the shock waves of the detonation were traveling for hundreds of miles, being picked up by hydrophones and seismic sensors from Okinawa to Hainan Island. For the crew of the Fitzgerald, the first 60 seconds of the engagement had passed. They had survived the initial blow, but the true battle was just beginning. The question that hung in the smoke-filled air was not just whether the ship could be saved, but who had placed a mine in a designated international shipping lane and how many more were waiting in the darkness. The United States Navy had entered a new kind of war, one where the enemy was invisible, and the battlefield was the very ground beneath their feet. 4:21 in the morning. Damage Control Locker Number 2. The damage control parties of the USS Fitzgerald were already moving before the general quarters alarm finished its first cycle. The air inside the narrow passageways was a thick, suffocating mix of white smoke and pulverized insulation that tasted like copper and burnt plastic. The deck beneath their boots was slick with a slurry of seawater and hydraulic fluid, slanted at an increasingly dangerous angle as the ship listed further to starboard. The damage control assistant, a lieutenant commander with 15 years of experience, coordinated the response from the damage control central station. On his status board, the lights for 3 major compartments berthing, 2, the forward machine shop, and the number 2 auxiliary room were glowing a steady, ominous red. These spaces were lost to the sea, a technical term that meant they had been completely bypassed by the crew to prevent the flooding from spreading to the rest of the ship. In the dim, flickering glow of battle lanterns, a repair team of 12 sailors struggled to reach a buckled bulkhead on Deck 3. They carried heavy wooden shoring timbers, metal jacks, and a portable P100 suction pump. The water in the passageway was already knee-deep, surging with every roll of the ship. "Get that shore in place!" the scene leader shouted. His voice was nearly drowned out by the roar of water rushing through a ruptured fire main. The sailors worked with a desperate, practiced efficiency, wedging the 6x6 timber against the straining steel of the bulkhead. As the ship groaned, the wood creaked under the pressure of hundreds of tons of seawater pressing against the other side. If this wall failed, the flooding would reach the forward engine room, and the USS Fitzgerald would lose what little electrical power it had left. The physical toll of the work was immense. The sailors were soaked to the bone, their hands bleeding from gripping jagged metal, their lungs burning from the smoke. Up on the mess decks, the culinary specialists and dental technicians had transformed the dining area into a primary triage station. 12 sailors had been brought in within the first 10 minutes. Most suffered from smoke inhalation or blunt force trauma from being thrown out of their racks. The medical officer and 2 corpsmen worked by the light of headlamps, their boots splashing in an inch of water that had leaked through the overhead. The ship's chaplain moved among the wounded, offering a steadying hand or a quiet word of encouragement. On the bridge, the commanding officer monitored the ship's stability. The list had stabilized at 9 degrees, thanks to the heroic efforts of the counterflooding teams. However, the USS Fitzgerald was sitting 3 meters lower in the water than she had been 10 minutes ago. Her bow was heavy, dipping into the 2-meter swells of the strait. The ship was silent except for the hum of a single emergency diesel generator. All non-essential systems had been cut. The damage control assistant keyed his radio, his voice cracking with exhaustion. "Bridge, this is Damage Control Central. Forward flooding is contained for now. Shoring is holding on Deck 3, but we are losing the battle with the auxiliary room. We need more pumps, and we need them 5 minutes ago." The commanding officer looked out at the empty horizon. He knew that the SOS signal had been sent, but in these waters, help was a complicated thing. The USS Fitzgerald was a wounded predator, and in the Taiwan Strait, there were many who had been waiting for exactly this moment. 4:25 in the morning. Naval Station, Yokosuka, Japan. The Maritime Operations Center of the United States 7th Fleet was usually a place of quiet, rhythmic efficiency, but the emergency flash precedence signal from the USS Fitzgerald tore through the stillness like a physical blow. Within 90 seconds, the room was a hive of controlled, high-speed activity. The air in the command center was cool and smelled of ozone and floor wax, a stark contrast to the humid, smoke-filled chaos unfolding 1,200 miles to the southwest. On the massive digital displays that covered the forward wall, the blue icon representing the USS Fitzgerald had turned a flashing, urgent amber. The watch officer, a commander with 3 tours in the Pacific, did not hesitate. He initiated the crisis action protocol for a major surface combatant disabled in a contested environment. The report was grim: an underwater detonation, massive flooding, loss of all propulsion, and unknown casualties. By 4:27 in the morning, the admiral commanding the 7th Fleet had been briefed in his quarters and was already on the secure line to Indo-Pacific Command in Hawaii. The response was a symphony of United States military power, choreographed over decades of contingency planning. At Kadena Air Base in Okinawa, a Pate Alpha Poseidon maritime patrol aircraft was ordered to execute an immediate scramble. The flight crew, who had been on standby for a routine surveillance mission, were in the cockpit and turning their twin jet engines within 11 minutes. Their mission was clear: get eyes on the USS Fitzgerald, establish a high-bandwidth communications relay, and search the surrounding waters for any sign of the vessel that had laid the mine. Simultaneously, 200 miles to the east of the Taiwan Strait, the aircraft carrier USS Ronald Reagan received the order to pivot. The 97,000-ton nuclear-powered carrier began a hard turn to the west, her 4 propeller shafts pushing the ship toward 30 knots. On her flight deck, the yellow-shirted handlers moved with practiced speed, preparing to launch a flight of 4 FA-18 Super Hornets and an E-2 Charlie Hawkeye for airborne early warning. The carrier strike group was moving into a high-threat posture, ready to provide a protective bubble over their wounded sister ship. The tactical data link, known as Link 16, began to populate with information. The destroyer USS Benfold, a DDG-65 located 80 miles north of the Fitzgerald's last known position, was ordered to proceed at flank speed. The Benfold's crew pushed their engines to the limit, the ship's bow slicing through the swells as they prepared their own damage control teams and medical facilities to assist the Fitzgerald. In the operations center, the analysts were already poring over satellite imagery and acoustic data. The coordinates of the blast 24 degrees 30 minutes north, 120 degrees 15 minutes east, placed the USS Fitzgerald right in the center of the deep water channel. The ghost mine theory was already circulating among the senior staff. This was not a random accident. It was a surgical strike designed to cripple a United States destroyer without leaving a clear fingerprint. "I want a full scan of the seabed along the transit corridor," the admiral ordered, his voice echoing in the silent room. "And I want to know exactly what is moving in the Chinese coastal sectors. If they try to move a recovery team toward our ship, I want to know the second they cast off their lines." The 7th Fleet response was not just about rescue. It was about asserting sovereignty. It was about asserting sovereignty and preventing an escalation. The United States Navy was broadcasting a clear message through its movements. The USS Fitzgerald was still a sovereign piece of American territory, and any attempt to interfere with her would be met with the full weight of a carrier strike group. By 5 in the morning, the Pate Alpha Poseidon was airborne, climbing to 30,000 feet and racing toward the strait at 450 knots. Back at Yokosuka, the logistics teams were already coordinating with the USNS Cesar Chavez, a dry cargo and ammunition ship, to reroute and provide emergency supplies. Every level of the United States military hierarchy was now engaged. The professionalism of the 7th Fleet was being tested in real time, and as the sun began to rise over the Pacific, the massive machinery of American naval power was fully in motion. 5:15 in the morning, the Taiwan Strait. The horizon was a jagged line of gray and gold when the first radar contact appeared on the handheld emergency sensors of the USS Fitzgerald. A massive silhouette, sharper and more angular than any American hull, broke through the morning mist exactly 10 miles to the west. It was a Type 55 destroyer, the lead ship of a People's Liberation Army Navy Surface Action Group, and it was closing at a steady 12 knots. The morning air was cold and damp, carrying the sharp scent of the sea mixed with the faint, oily smell of the Fitzgerald's leaking fuel. On the bridge of the Fitzgerald, the commanding officer squinted through his binoculars at the approaching vessel. The Type 55 was a formidable opponent, carrying 112 vertical launch cells and a sophisticated Type 346 Bravo radar system. Under normal circumstances, the Fitzgerald would be tracking the Chinese ship with its own Aegis combat system from over 100 miles away. Now, the American destroyer was a wounded animal, and the Predator was closing in. The bridge radio crackled to life on the international hailing frequency. The voice was calm, speaking in fluent English with a clipped, professional tone. United States Navy Destroyer 62, this is Chinese warship 101. We have detected a massive underwater detonation within the maritime exclusion zone. We are proceeding to your position to provide immediate humanitarian assistance and to ensure the safety of navigation in these waters. The commanding officer of the Fitzgerald gripped the handset of the bridge radio. He knew exactly what humanitarian assistance meant in this context. If the Chinese sailors set foot on his deck, they would be there to document the damage, seize sensitive encryption hardware, and claim the ship as a hazard to navigation. Chinese Warship 101. This is USS Fitzgerald. We appreciate the offer, but we are a sovereign United States Navy vessel. We have our own recovery assets inbound. You are requested to maintain a distance of 5,000 yards. Do not approach. The response from the Type 55 was immediate and icy. USS Fitzgerald, Your vessel is leaking hazardous materials into a sensitive ecological zone. You are currently a dead ship in a high-traffic lane. Under international maritime law, we have an obligation to intervene, to prevent a collision or environmental disaster. We will be alongside you in 20 minutes. The tactical situation was deteriorating faster than the flooding. The Type 55 was now only 7 miles away, its bow wave a white scar on the dark water. On the Fitzgerald, the crew was defenseless. The 5-inch gun was dead without electrical power. The vertical launch system was locked behind fried circuits. The only weapons available were the M250 caliber machine guns and M4 carbines held by the ship's security reaction force, who were now lining the rails in their life jackets and ballistic vests. High above, the low-frequency drone of the Pate Alpha Poseidon became a roar. As the maritime patrol aircraft banked hard over the two ships, the pilot dropped a series of active sonobuoys, creating a sonar curtain between the Fitzgerald and the approaching Chinese destroyer. The Pate commander keyed his radio, broadcasting on the same open channel. Chinese warship 101. This is United States Navy aircraft 724. You are currently interfering with a United States Navy recovery operation. We have a carrier strike group inbound and multiple surface combatants within 1 hour of this position. You are directed to alter course to the west immediately. For 3 minutes, there was absolute silence on the radio. The Type 55 continued its steady advance, the range closing to 5 miles. The sun was fully above the horizon now, glinting off the massive integrated mast of the Chinese ship. Then, the Type 55 adjusted its course by a mere 5 degrees, not turning away, but positioning itself to cross the Fitzgerald's bow. This was a game of maritime chicken played with billions of dollars of hardware and hundreds of lives. The Chinese destroyer was testing the resolve of a crippled ship and a single aircraft. On the Fitzgerald, the sailors watched the gray hull of the enemy ship grow larger, the smell of its diesel exhaust now drifting across their own deck. The tension was a physical weight, heavier than the water still pressing against the shoring in the lower decks. The shadow had arrived, and it was not planning to leave until it had seen exactly how much damage the ghost mine had done to the pride of the 7th Fleet. 5:45 in the morning. The number 1 emergency diesel generator on the USS Fitzgerald shuddered violently and fell silent. The last remaining source of electrical power was gone, leaving the 9,600-ton destroyer a dark, drifting mass of steel in the middle of the Taiwan Strait. The sudden silence inside the ship was absolute, broken only by the sound of seawater lapping against the buckled hull and the distant, rhythmic clanging of a loose hatch on the mess deck. The air in the passageways, already thick with smoke, grew cold and stagnant as the ventilation fans ceased their rotation. On the bridge, the commanding officer felt the vibration of the deck die beneath his boots. The few remaining status lights on the console flickered once and vanished. He was now commanding a vessel that was functionally blind and deaf. The only light came from the gray dawn filtering through the shattered bridge windows and the pale glow of a few handheld tactical tablets. The Type 55 destroyer was now less than 4 miles away, a predatory shape cutting through the morning mist, its own powerful radar arrays pulsing with an energy the Fitzgerald could no longer match. "All hands to manual battle stations," the commanding officer ordered, his voice echoing in the unpowered space. "Get the M250 caliber teams on the rails. If that ship puts a boat in the water, I want a clear line of sight on it. Do not fire unless fired upon, but make it clear we are still a sovereign deck." The response from the crew was a testament to United States Navy training. Sailors, who had been awake for 24 hours, soaked in seawater and fuel, scrambled up the ladders to the weather decks. They unlimbered the heavy machine guns, slamming the charging handles back on the M250 calibers and the M240 Bravo light machine guns. They stood in the damp morning air, the smell of salt spray and diesel exhaust from the Chinese ship now unmistakable. They were vulnerable, but they were not surrendered. The tactical situation shifted at 5:52 in the morning. From the east, a new sound began to roll across the water, a low-frequency roar that rapidly intensified into a high-pitched scream. Two FA-18 Super Hornets, launched from the USS Ronald Reagan, broke through the low cloud layer at 3,000 feet. They were flying in a tight combat spread, their gray wings banked hard as they executed a high-speed show of force directly over the USS Fitzgerald. The roar of the twin 414 engines was so loud it vibrated the teeth of every sailor on the deck. The fighters pulled into a vertical climb, dumping magnesium flares that burned like miniature suns against the gray sky, a universal signal of intent. Following closely behind was an E-2 Charlie Hawkeye, its massive rotodome spinning as it established a total sensor umbrella over the area, linking the crippled destroyer into the wider 7th Fleet tactical network via satellite. The arrival of United States air cover changed the calculus for the Chinese commander. The Type 55 destroyer slowed its advance, the white foam at its bow settling as it dropped to 5 knots. On the bridge of the Fitzgerald, the radio crackled again, powered now by a portable emergency battery. The voice from the Chinese ship was less confident, more measured. United States Navy vessel. We observe your air assets. We are remaining on station to ensure no navigation hazards interfere with your recovery. We will maintain a distance of 4,000 yards. The commanding officer of the Fitzgerald did not reply. He watched as the two Super Hornets leveled off at 10,000 feet, circling the ship like hawks. Below decks, the struggle continued. The damage control teams were working in pitch darkness, using headlamps to navigate the flooded compartments. They were using manual hand pumps now, a grueling, back-breaking process to keep the water level from rising any further. The strategic objective of the United States Navy was now clear. Hold the perimeter until the destroyer USS Benfold could arrive to provide a physical screen and electrical jumpstart. The Taiwan Strait had become a theater of high-stakes signaling. Every movement of the Chinese destroyer was tracked by the Hawkeye overhead. Every adjustment of the Fitzgerald's list was reported back to Yokosuka. The sun was now fully up, revealing the true extent of the damage. The USS Fitzgerald sat low in the water, a jagged scar visible just above the waterline where the mine's pressure wave had vented through the hull. Debris from the internal compartment's papers, life vests, and insulation trailed behind the ship for half a mile. Despite the arrival of the fighters, the tension had not broken. It had merely frozen into a cold standoff. The next hour would determine if this incident would remain a maritime accident or escalate into the first engagement of a wider Pacific conflict. 6:15 in the morning. The western horizon of the Taiwan Strait. 6 Chinese HOUBEI class fast attack craft emerged from the coastal haze, their twin hulls cutting the water at a frantic 45 knots. They moved in a staggered line abreast, closing the distance to the drifting USS Fitzgerald with unmistakable aggressive intent. The morning air was cold and damp, smelling of salt and the sharp ozone scent of the E-2 Charlie Hawkeye's radar pulsing overhead. The lead pilot of the FA-18 Super Hornet flight, callsign Maverick 1, watched the digital boxes on his heads-up display tighten. As the boats ignored the final radio warning from the carrier strike group, the tactical situation was at a breaking point. At coordinates 24 degrees 35 minutes north, 120 degrees 10 minutes east, these fast attack craft were armed with C-802 anti-ship missiles, weapons capable of finishing what the mine had started. On the deck of the Fitzgerald, the sailors of the Security Reaction Force gripped their M4 carbines, their knuckles white. They were watching the silhouettes of the boats grow larger against the gray sea, knowing their manual machine guns were the only line of defense left on the darkened ship. Maverick 1 is weapons-free, the command echoed from the E-2 Charlie Hawkeye. The pilot banked his 40,000-pound fighter into a steep 60-degree dive, the G-forces pressing him deep into his seat. He lined up the lead fast attack craft in his pipper. With a firm, disciplined squeeze of the trigger, the M61A2 Vulcan cannon screamed to life. A stream of 20mm high-explosive incendiary rounds poured from the nose of the jet, a laser-straight line of white tracers connecting the aircraft to the sea. The vibration of the gun shook the entire airframe and the sharp smell of cordite and hydraulic fluid filled the cockpit. The lead HOUBEI craft had no time to maneuver or deploy decoys. The 20mm shells punched straight through the aluminum superstructure, detonating the ready-use ammunition for its 30mm Gatling gun. The bridge of the small vessel erupted in a spectacular blossom of orange fire and white spray. 6-inch pieces of hot metal were sent flying 200 meters into the air. The secondary explosion of its fuel tanks ripped the hull open from the inside out, sending a wall of water and burning diesel over the following boats. The heat of the blast was so intense it bleached the morning gray for 3 full seconds. The remaining 5 Chinese vessels reacted with chaotic desperation. They broke their formation instantly, turning hard to port and starboard to avoid the spreading oil slick and the sinking debris of their leader. One boat slammed its rudders so hard it nearly capsized in its own wake, while another began firing its anti-aircraft guns blindly into the sky in a panic-induced response. The disciplined, high-speed advance had been shattered in exactly 4 seconds of precision American fire. The crews of the remaining boats were no longer thinking of an assault. They were struggling to maintain control of their vessels in a sea of fire. Black smoke boiled from the water where the lead boat had been, a thick, oily column of soot rising to meet the low clouds. The surface of the strait was now littered with jagged fragments of hull plating and orange life jackets bobbing in the swell. Maverick 1 pulled his fighter back into a screaming vertical climb, his wingman already rolling into position for the next pass. The silence of the dawn had been permanently broken by the sound of high-intensity combat, and the stakes of the Fitzgerald incident had just shifted from a maritime rescue to a hot engagement. 10 miles to the west, the Type 55 destroyer reacted to the strike. Its large AN/SPY-6 equivalent radar arrays transitioned from search to track mode, bathing the Super Hornets in high-energy microwave radiation. The Chinese ship did not fire, but its missile hatches were seen cycling open on the long-range cameras of the Hawkeye. The standoff had turned violent, and the physical reality of the destroyed fast-attack craft was a warning written in fire and steel. On the bridge of the Fitzgerald, the commanding officer watched the smoke rise. He knew that the first blood had been drawn, but he also knew that for every boat destroyed, there were dozens more in the Chinese coastal bases. The United States Navy had established a perimeter of fire, but the question was how long they could hold it before the Type 55 destroyer decided to engage with its own massive battery of long-range missiles. The air over the strait was now thick with the smell of burning fuel and the lingering roar of jet engines, a sensory reminder that the rules of engagement had changed forever. 6:17 in the morning. The radar room of the Type 55 destroyer. The Chinese commander did not wait for further clarification from his superiors before authorizing a retaliatory strike against the American fighters. From the vertical launch cells on the forward deck of the Type 55, 2 HQ-9 surface-to-air missiles erupted in a twin pillar of white fire that bleached the gray morning sky. The air around the Chinese ship was instantly filled with the deafening roar of solid rocket motors and the sharp, chemical stench of burning propellant that hung in the humid air like a physical weight. High above, the pilot of Maverick 1 saw the 2 white streaks rising from the sea at 3 times the speed of sound, his cockpit suddenly screaming with the frantic, high-pitched warble of a lethal radar lock. The HQ-9 missiles moved with terrifying agility, their seeker heads locked onto the heat signatures of the FA-18 Super Hornets. Maverick 1 banked his aircraft into a high G brake turn, pulling 9 times the force of gravity as he punched out a cloud of magnesium flares and bundles of chaff. The heat from the flares burned at over 2,000 degrees, creating a false sun that momentarily confused the lead missile. However, the second missile adjusted its flight path in a fraction of a second, its proximity fuse sensing the mass of the American fighter. The warhead detonated 30 meters from the Hornet's left wing. The blast wave was a physical hammer that slammed into the airframe, sending a cloud of shrapnel through the outer wing panel and the vertical stabilizer. The pilot felt the aircraft shudder violently, the controls momentarily turning to lead in his hands as the left engine ingested a fragment of its own casing. A fireball erupted from the wing root, trailing a long, jagged plume of black smoke against the clouds. Maverick 1 fought the stick, his breathing heavy and ragged through his oxygen mask, as he wrestled the crippled jet back into level flight. On the sea below, the immediate aftermath of the exchange was a scene of escalating chaos. The remaining Chinese fast attack craft, seeing their flagship engage, turned back toward the USS Fitzgerald, their own C-802 missile rails beginning to elevate. But the window of opportunity for a second strike was closing. From the north, the destroyer DDG-65, USS Benfold, finally arrived on the scene at 32 knots, her bow slicing through the swells and creating a massive wall of white spray that towered over her 5-inch gun mount. The USS Benfold did not hesitate. She slid into a position exactly 1,500 yards between the crippled Fitzgerald and the approaching Chinese formation, effectively acting as a $300 million steel shield. Her AN/SPY-1 radar was radiating at maximum power, a digital snarl that informed every Chinese sensor in the strait that she was ready to fire her own battery of 96 missiles. The air between the ships was thick with the smell of burnt explosive and the heavy wet scent of a rising sea. The immediate casualty report from the morning's engagement was grim. One Chinese HOUBEI class boat was a total loss, with 14 crew members missing and presumed dead. The remaining 5 boats had suffered varying degrees of splinter damage. On the American side, Maverick 1 was limping back toward the USS Ronald Reagan with a shredded wing and a dead engine. The USS Fitzgerald remained powerless, her list holding at 9 degrees, but she was no longer alone in the dark. Silence returned to the radio frequencies for exactly 60 seconds, a dead stillness that felt more dangerous than the sound of the cannons. The Type 55 destroyer slowed to a crawl, its missile hatches remaining open, but its fire control radars shifting back to a standby state. The message was received. The United States Navy would defend its wounded with lethal force, regardless of the diplomatic cost. The first exchange of the Ghost Mine War had ended in a bloody draw, leaving the surface of the Taiwan Strait littered with the burning wreckage of one side and the shattered wings of the other. 7:45 in the morning. The Central Taiwan Strait. The USNS Cesar Chavez, a Lewis and Clark class dry cargo and ammunition ship designated TAKE-14, arrived on station to find the USS Fitzgerald still struggling against the incoming tide. The massive 10,000-ton supply ship maneuvered with surprising grace, pulling alongside the crippled destroyer at a distance of 60 meters. The air between the two hulls was instantly filled with the heavy, sweet smell of DFM marine diesel and the rhythmic, industrial whine of high-tension hydraulic winches. Despite the 9-degree list of the Fitzgerald, the logistics crews began the delicate process of an emergency skin-to-skin transfer of critical survival equipment. The logistics of keeping a wounded destroyer afloat in a combat zone required more than just courage. It required thousands of pounds of specialized hardware. Using a heavy-duty sliding kingpost system, the crew of the Cesar Chavez began transferring 20 additional P-100 portable suction pumps to the Fitzgerald. Each pump was a 100-pound lifeline capable of moving 100 gallons of seawater per minute. Along with the pumps came 3,000 feet of reinforced suction hose and 200 units of K-type steel shoring, necessary to reinforce the buckled bulkheads that were still groaning under the pressure of the Pacific Ocean. The sea state in the strait was rising, with 2-meter swells now causing the two ships to roll in an asynchronous rhythm that threatened to snap the transfer lines. The decks of the Fitzgerald were slick, with a dangerous mixture of salt spray and leaked hydraulic fluid, making every movement a calculated risk for the sailors receiving the gear. They worked in silence, their faces set in masks of exhaustion, their hands protected by heavy leather gloves that were quickly soaked through. The physical vibration of the Cesar Chavez's massive engines hummed through the water, a comforting reminder that the logistics tail of the United States Navy had finally arrived. Simultaneously, the Cesar Chavez deployed a specialized mobile, diving and salvage unit from its stern. A team of 12 deep-sea divers, supported by 2 Mk-18 Mod, 2 Kingfish unmanned, underwater vehicles, began a subsurface survey of the Fitzgerald's hull. The video feed from the Kingfish drones, transmitted via fiber optic cable to the bridge, revealed the true extent of the ghost mine damage. The keel was not just buckled, it was fractured in 2 places, and the hull plating near the No. 2 machinery room had been peeled back like a tin can. The divers worked in the dark, churning water beneath the destroyer, using ultrasonic sensors to check for unexploded ordnance that might still be clinging to the jagged steel. The smell of the divers' bottled breathing gas and the sharp, metallic tang of underwater cutting torches began to drift upward. They were racing against time. Every hour the ship spent low in the water increased the structural fatigue on the remaining sound bulkheads. To the west, the Chinese Type 55 destroyer watched the entire operation through high-resolution electro-optical sensors. It remained 4,000 yards away, a silent observer to the industrial might of the United States military's logistics chain. The presence of the Cesar Chavez turned the site into a semi-permanent salvage camp, signaling to the People's Liberation Army that the United States had no intention of abandoning the vessel or allowing it to be seized as a hazard. By 8:30 in the morning, the first emergency fuel lines were connected. The Cesar Chavez began pumping low-sulfur diesel into the Fitzgerald's aft tanks, a strategic move to shift the ship's center of gravity and counter the forward list. The transfer of 300 tons of fuel was a slow, meticulous process, monitored by sailors with handheld radios who checked the tank levels every 60 seconds. The logistics of survival were proving to be as complex as the battle itself, a war of pumps, hoses, and steel beams fought in the shadow of an enemy fleet. 9:15 in the morning. The flight deck of the USS Fitzgerald. 2 MH-60 Sierra helicopters, belonging to Helicopter C Combat Squadron 12, from the USS Ronald Reagan, appeared as dark specks against the hazy northern horizon. The air over the destroyer was a violent cyclone of salt spray and the hot, kerosene-scented exhaust of the hovering aircraft. Because of the ship's 9-degree list to starboard and the buckled nature of the aft superstructure, a standard landing was impossible. The pilots would have to execute a precision, hover hoist operation while the ship rolled in the increasing 2-meter swells of the Taiwan Strait. The lead helicopter, call sign Red Knight 602, stabilized its hover exactly 40 feet above the slanted gray steel of the aft flight deck. The downdraft from the 4-bladed main rotor was a physical force, whipping the residual smoke and the iridescent sheen of leaked fuel into a fine, stinging mist. On the deck below, the search and rescue swimmers transitioned from the aircraft to the ship via a steel hoist cable, their bright orange fins and black wetsuits a sharp contrast to the drab tactical gear of the Fitzgerald's crew. The medical evacuation was a race against the physiological clock. Inside the darkened mess decks, the triage teams had stabilized 15 sailors, but 3 remained in critical condition with 3rd-degree steam burns and internal trauma. These men were strapped into Stokes litters, stainless steel baskets designed for high-angle rescue. Every movement was a struggle. The sailors carrying the litters had to navigate ladders and passageways that were tilted at an unnatural angle, their boots slipping on wet metal. Litter coming up. Steady on the cable. The hoist operator in the MH-60 Sierra helicopter called out over the internal radio. His eyes were locked on the small patch of deck below, his hand hovering over the emergency cable cutter. As the first litter cleared the safety netting of the ship, the helicopter shifted slightly in a sudden gust of wind. The basket swayed toward the jagged remains of a radar mast, but the pilot corrected the position with a micro-adjustment of the cyclic, the engines whining as they compensated for the change in load. The physical sensation on the deck was overwhelming. The roar of the twin T-700 engines blotted out all conversation, forcing the crew to use hand signals. The smell of the sea was replaced by the dry, chemical heat of the aircraft's exhaust. One by one, the critically injured were lifted from the deck and pulled into the cramped, equipment-filled cabins of the Seahawks. The search and rescue swimmers remained on the ship, providing additional medical expertise to those whose injuries were less severe but still required professional stabilization. By 10 in the morning, the two helicopters turned back toward the northeast, banking hard toward the medical facilities of the carrier strike group. The wounded would be in a full-scale surgical suite on the USS Ronald Reagan within 45 minutes. On the Fitzgerald, the departure of the aircraft left a sudden, ringing silence that was almost as heavy as the noise. The most vulnerable members of the crew were gone, but the 300 remaining sailors now faced the grim reality of a ship that was still partially flooded and miles from safety. The medevac was a masterclass in United States Navy coordination, executed under the watchful eyes of the Chinese Type 55 destroyer, which remained a silent shadow 4,000 yards away. The rescue operation had been conducted without a single verbal exchange between the American helicopters and the Chinese ship, a testament to the cold professionalism that now defined the strait. The air was still thick, with the lingering scent of jet fuel, a sensory anchor for a crew that had just watched their brothers being carried into the sky. This phase of the campaign report highlights the transition from immediate combat survival to long-term recovery. The United States military had successfully maintained a protective bubble over the Fitzgerald, allowing for the safe extraction of casualties despite the proximity of hostile forces. However, as the helicopters vanished into the clouds, the commanding officer of the Fitzgerald turned his attention back to the water. The ghost mine had done its damage, and now the focus shifted to the intelligence teams arriving to determine exactly how the pride of the 7th Fleet had been blindsided in its own backyard. 11:15 in the morning, the water-slicked flight deck of the USS Fitzgerald. The specialized explosive ordnance disposal team from Mobile Unit 5 had arrived to solve a mystery that threatened every ship in the 7th Fleet. How had a 9,000-ton destroyer, equipped with the most advanced sonar in the world, failed to see a 300-pound sphere of high explosives? The air was thick with the smell of wet salt and the sharp, acrid tang of scorched carbon fiber that the divers had recovered from the jagged edges of the hull. On the bridge of the USS Benfold, now acting as the tactical command center, 3 civilian analysts from the Office of Naval Intelligence stared at a high-resolution digital reconstruction of the blast site. The data recovered by the Mk-18 Mod 2 Kingfish underwater vehicles was disturbing. The mine was not a traditional steel-cased weapon from the Cold War era. The fragments pulled from the Fitzgerald's machinery room revealed a hull made of a complex carbon fiber composite, coated in a radar-absorbent material similar to that used on stealth aircraft. This ghost mine was designed to be acoustically transparent, allowing the sonar pulses of an Arleigh Burke-class destroyer to pass right through it as if it were nothing more than a patch of silt or a school of fish. It is a frequency-matched coating, the lead analyst explained, his voice low and professional as he pointed to the screen. The skin of the mine is tuned to the exact frequency of our ANSQQ-89 sonar suite. It does not reflect the sound. It swallows it. The intelligence report, designated Flash Secret, detailed a new generation of Chinese naval ordnance. These mines were not just stealthy, they were intelligent. They utilized a low-frequency magnetic sensor that could distinguish the specific magnetic signature of a United States Navy propulsion shaft from a civilian tanker. The mine that struck the Fitzgerald had ignored 2 commercial container ships that passed over it earlier that morning, waiting specifically for the magnetic fingerprint of a 7th Fleet destroyer. The strategic implications were catastrophic. The Taiwan Strait, one of the busiest shipping lanes in the world, was now seeded with invisible killers that the United States Navy could not reliably detect. The ghost mines had effectively turned the strait into a closed door. To clear them, the Navy would need to deploy specialized mine countermeasure ships, but those vessels were slow, lightly armed, and would be sitting ducks for the Type 55 destroyer still looming on the horizon. On the deck of the Fitzgerald, the explosive ordnance disposal technicians used a portable X-ray scanner on a second, unexploded object found snagged in the ship's stabilizer fin. The image that appeared on their handheld tablet showed a complex internal array of microelectronics and a high-explosive warhead consisting of 200 pounds of PBXN-5. The casing was etched with no serial numbers and no manufacturing marks. It was a weapon designed for plausible deniability. The physical sensation of the investigation was one of cold, clinical dread. The analysts worked under the blue glow of tactical screens, their faces illuminated by the data that proved their technological advantage had been neutralized. The smell of the sea was now tainted by the odor of the chemical reagents used to test the mine fragments. Every sailor on the surrounding ships looked at the water differently now. The dark waves were no longer just a medium for travel, but a hiding place for a threat they could not see until it was too late. By noon, the preliminary report was transmitted via a secure satellite link to the Pentagon and the National Security Council. The discovery of the ghost mines shifted the Fitzgerald incident from a localized tactical failure to a national security crisis. The United States was no longer just recovering a ship. It was facing a technological ambush that required an immediate and total shift in Pacific strategy. As the intelligence teams packed their sensors, the commanding officer of the 7th Fleet prepared to issue a new set of orders that would change the rules of engagement for every American vessel in the Western Pacific. 12:30 in the afternoon, the northern entrance to the Taiwan Strait. The commander of the 7th Fleet ordered a total strategic reconfiguration of every American asset within 500 miles of the USS Fitzgerald. The tactical posture shifted from a rescue operation to a sanitized corridor protocol, a high-intensity effort to regain control of the underwater domain. The air over the strait was now a crowded corridor of electronic warfare, vibrating with the high-output jamming signals of 3 EA-18 Gulf Growler aircraft. The smell of the sea was masked by the scent of ozone and the dry heat of the massive computer banks inside the carrier strike group's command centers. Two littoral combat ships, the USS Gabrielle Giffords and the USS Mobile, surged south from Okinawa at 40 knots. Their shallow draft hulls designed specifically for the treacherous waters of the strait. These vessels carried the newly operational Mine Countermeasure Mission Package, a suite of sensors and unmanned systems built to find what the Aegis destroyers could not. As they approached the Fitzgerald's position, they deployed 6 unmanned underwater vehicles, each one a 4-meter-long yellow cylinder, that dove into the dark water to begin a high-resolution laser scan of the seabed. The 7th Fleet established what the analysts called the Steel Curtain. 4 Arleigh Burke-class destroyers, including the newly arrived USS Benfold and USS Higgins, formed a box around the crippled Fitzgerald and the supply ship USNS Cesar Chavez. They operated with their sonar suites in a high-power active mode, sending rhythmic, metallic pings through the water that could be felt by the divers working on the Fitzgerald's hull. The sound was a constant, driving pulse, a physical reminder that the United States Navy was no longer playing a game of shadows. High above, an MQ-4 Bravo Triton drone circled at 60,000 feet, its long-range infrared cameras tracking every movement of the Chinese fleet. The Type 55 destroyer had been joined by 2 Type 054 Alpha frigates, forming their own counterline 5 miles to the west. The air was thick with the silent, invisible collision of radar beams and data links. Every sailor on the American ships was at a modified state of general quarters, their hands never far from their weapons, their eyes scanning the horizon for the white wake of a missile or the silhouette of a fast attack craft. The first test of the new strategic pivot occurred at 1:15 in the afternoon. An unmanned underwater vehicle, operating 3 miles south of the Fitzgerald, identified a high-confidence target on the seabed. It was a teardrop-shaped object, coated in the same frequency-matched stealth material found on the ghost mine. Following the new rules of engagement, the commander of the USS Gabrielle Giffords did not wait for further identification. He authorized the deployment of a Seafox neutralization charge. The remote-operated charge, a small torpedo-like device, swam to the coordinates and latched onto the mine. 5 seconds later, a massive white plume of water erupted from the surface, rising 40 meters into the air. The shockwave was felt as a sharp thud against the hulls of the nearby American ships. The detonation was a clear signal to the Chinese observers. The invisibility of their new weapon had been compromised. The United States Navy was now actively hunting the hunters. The strategic pivot was not just about technology. It was about resolve. By saturating the area with mine-clearing assets and high-end surface combatants, the 7th Fleet was reasserting its right to operate in international waters. The cost was immense. Billions of dollars in hardware and thousands of personnel were now tied to a single 10-mile square of the Pacific, but the alternative was to cede the strait to an invisible enemy. On the bridge of the Fitzgerald, the commanding officer watched the smoke from the mine detonation dissipate. The ship was still powerless, and the list remained a stubborn 9 degrees, but the atmosphere had changed. The sense of being a hunted animal had been replaced by the focused energy of a combined arms operation. The air in the bridge was still heavy with the smell of the sea and the metallic tang of the shattered windows, but for the first time since 4:15 in the morning, the initiative was shifting back to the United States. The Ghost Mine War was no longer a one-sided ambush. It was a systematic, grinding campaign to clear the path to safety. 2 in the afternoon, the southern exit of the Taiwan Strait. The destroyer, DDG-62 USS Fitzgerald, was finally moving under the power of another, her buckled bow cutting a slow, heavy wake through the gray-green swells. The USNS Sioux, a fleet ocean tug, had taken the strain of a 2-inch steel towing hawser, pulling the 8,400 tons of crippled warship toward the deep water of the Philippine Sea. The air was filled with the clean, sharp scent of the open ocean and the low-frequency thrum of the Sioux's 4,000 horsepower engines, a sound that signaled the end of the immediate crisis. The 9-degree list of the Fitzgerald remained a stubborn, visible scar of the morning's violence, but for the first time in 10 hours, the ship was no longer drifting at the mercy of the current. The transit out of the strait was a tense, 20-mile procession of American naval power. To the west, the Chinese Type 55 destroyer and her 2 accompanying frigates maintained a parallel course, their gray hulls silhouetted against the hazy coastline of mainland China. They remained exactly 5 miles away, their sensors active but their weapon hatches closed. The silent standoff had transitioned into a cold, watchful peace. Above the formation, the constant roar of FA-18 Super Hornets and the high-altitude orbit of the MQ-4 Bravo Triton drone ensured that the sanitized corridor remained unbroken. Inside the Fitzgerald, the work of the crew had shifted from the frantic energy of survival to the grim reality of recovery. The final casualty report was confirmed at 3 in the afternoon. 7 United States Navy sailors had been killed in the initial detonation when the mine's pressure wave collapsed the forward berthing compartments. 23 others were injured, 3 of them critically. The names of the fallen were recorded in the ship's log, a somber addition to the history of a vessel that had already seen more than its share of tragedy in the Pacific. The physical damage to the ship was estimated at $1.5 billion. The keel was fractured. The Aegis combat system's forward arrays were out of alignment, and 2 of the 4 gas turbine engines were contaminated by seawater and silt. The USS Fitzgerald would not return to the line for at least 2 years. She was bound for the Naval Repair Facility at Guam, a 300-mile journey that would be conducted at a cautious 5 knots. The strategic aftermath of the Ghost Mine incident was already being felt in every corner of the United States military. The Taiwan Strait was no longer considered a routine transit zone. The discovery of stealth-coded, frequency-matched naval mines had rendered the Navy's standard acoustic sensors obsolete in shallow, contested waters. By 4 in the afternoon, Pacific Command had issued a mandatory mine countermeasure escort order for all surface combatants passing through the first island chain. The era of the invisible mine had begun, and the United States Navy was now forced to rebuild its shallow water doctrine from the seabed up. As the sun began to set, casting long, orange shadows over the water, the USS Fitzgerald crossed the final threshold into the open sea. The Chinese warships turned back toward the west, their wakes disappearing into the evening mist. On the deck of the Fitzgerald, the sailors, who were not on watch, stood at the rail, watching the coastline fade. They were exhausted, their uniforms stained with fuel and salt. But they were alive. They had held their ship against an invisible enemy and maintained their perimeter under the guns of a superpower. The Fitzgerald incident would be remembered not as a victory, but but as a professional and disciplined recovery in the face of a technological ambush. The United States Navy had proven it could sustain a hit, adapt its strategy in real time, and protect its own under the most extreme conditions. But as the dark water of the Pacific rose to meet the hull of the destroyer, every sailor on board knew the truth. The waters of the Western Pacific were no longer a transparent blue. They were a black, opaque battlefield where the next threat was already waiting, silent and unseen, for the next magnetic signature to pass overhead.